Right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the virtual launch for Philip Cunliffe's important new book, Cosmopolitan, Dystopia, International Intervention and the Failure of the West. I'm Lee Jones from Queen Mary University of London, and I'm really delighted and honoured to be chairing this event. I'd also like to thank Chris Hart at Manchester University Press for organising the talk and making the technical arrangements. Phil's going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and answers at the end. On your screen, you should see a control panel which contains options for questions and chat. The chat function is for you to raise any technical problems, which we'll try to fix for you. And please use the questions option to type any questions throughout the talk, and I'll relay those to Phil later in the Q&A section. Please do ask questions because Phil does want this event to be interactive. Now, we only have an hour, so I can't do a long introduction, but I do want to say very briefly that Cosmopolitan Dystopia is a genuinely important book. If you haven't read it yet, you definitely should. And tomorrow you will get a 50% discount voucher by email, so you can buy 2 copies. The book really is the culmination of, say, 15 years worth of research on intervention. And as with all of Phil's work, it brims with bold and original arguments. And above all, it's not just a work on intervention, but on the very fate of the international order itself. So Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and thank you for the kind words. And thanks again to Manchester University Press, my publisher, and to Chris Hart in particular for being so nimble and quick in adapting to the circumstances of the COVID pandemic and setting up a virtual seminar to give me the opportunity to talk about my book. So I suppose what I'd like to begin with is to ask everyone if they could maybe just cast their minds back before the COVID pandemic a few years ago to the announcement and launch of the Islamic State in Iraq. And in particular, and I'm going to share my screen with you now. Hopefully everyone can see that. A picture of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed Caliph of Islamic State. And this is the speech that he gave in a mosque in Raqqa when they declared Islamic State. And it was a very important moment politically for me in helping to shape my understanding of the dynamics of intervention today. And also another event around the formation of Islamic State, which was these events as well, which happened around about the same time. And you can see on the left part of the screen a tweet from when and a picture from when ISIS forces bulldozed the border posts between Syria and Iraq in the territory that they claimed in those 2 countries. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see passports that Islamic State jihadists burned as a gesture of them refusing their national identities, renouncing their national identities in favor of support for Islamic State. And also, this was part of the wider claims that were made by Islamic State at the time. And what was particularly striking to me, and perhaps surprising, given the ostentatious barbarism that Islamic State was so proud to display to the rest of the world, was also the political discourse with which they made their claims. And so in particular, in the speech with which the Caliph pronounced the formation of Islamic State, he made claims about how the Islamic State represented a new kind of political order. And he invited his followers from around the world to trample what he called the idols of nationalism and democracy. And this was, as we can see, kind of part of, at the same time, the demolition of the borders between the 2 countries and the territory that they claimed, the renunciation of national identity. And the Caliph also called upon everyone to join together, obviously under his leadership. And he promised that in Islamic State, there would be no differences between Easterners and Westerners, between Arabs and non-Arabs, between black and white. Everyone would belong to the same political order. And what was striking about this, in addition to those particular points, was also the fact that despite the fact that Islamic State claimed legal and political jurisdiction in the territory of Iraq and Syria, they were not a conventional state and not a meaningful, not in any way a kind of recognizable traditional or modern political entity that we could understand, because there was no limit to their jurisdiction either. In principle, the Islamic State could expand to take over the entire world. I mean, obviously it wasn't capable of doing so, but there was no claim on the limit to its, there was no outer limit to the territory that it claimed. And at the same time, there was no way in which it claimed to represent any national or ethnic group that had hitherto been excluded from international recognition. So it was impossible, for instance, to expect Islamic State to take a seat in the United Nations General Assembly. Not only because the Islamic State were opposed by the states on whose territory they were mounting their uprising, but also because the Islamic State themselves didn't recognize the claims of the United Nations. The idea that Islamic State could sit alongside other states, which it recognized as other kind of equally legitimate states that were on the same level as Islamic State, and that it could recognize the higher authority of the United Nations, was anathema to it, because obviously it claimed direct authority from God, that the Caliph was the representative of God on earth. So what struck me about this, all of this, thinking about all of this together, was that rather than being dredged up from Islamic law or Islamic history, it seemed to me that we were dealing with, in fact, themes in Islamic State that were very contemporary and very much part of the contemporary order and the contemporary moment. Not least the fact that you have the idea of calling upon more ethereal sources of authority higher than those of the nation state, higher than those of state sovereignty, to legitimate a new kind of political order that was going to be explicitly transnational and explicitly substitute for the authority of the secular sovereign state. In addition to that, thousands and thousands of people from all over the world felt that they would buy into this. And when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared Islamic State as this kind of new political order, he was right in as much as it was multiracial, it was multinational, it was multi-ethnic, it was genuinely cosmopolitan. And all of these people who participated, they felt vested in the civil war in Syria. They felt vested in the humanitarian problems of the Syrian people, and they felt that they had to do something by going to Islamic State, going to the territory of Islamic State in order to support it. So what all of this suggested to me was that Islamic State was showing us in a dark and twisted form, holding up a mirror to our own contemporary international order, just to say a cosmopolitan order, an order which was based around the supersession of the sovereign state, the supersession of national political systems, by invoking a higher ideal, an ideal of an authority which was above that of the nation state, and that would erase nation states in favor of this larger, more expansive political vision. And that ideal, I think, is best called the cosmopolitan political ideal. So what this, setting it up like this, what I try to argue in the book and what I try to present in the book, is that we need to have a shift in our perspective. So rather than thinking of the problems of international order and the problems of Syria and Iraq simply as errors of foreign policy, simply as strategic calamities, as problems, mistakes perpetrated by foreign policy elites, or diplomatic mistakes, or even simply as civil wars and conflicts that that are remote from us. Instead of thinking of those things instead of understanding them as being characterized by absence, say by the absence of responsible statecraft, by the absence of post-war planning, by the absence of any kind of viable or coherent political strategy for the region, I think instead that we should think about what's happening in places like Syria and Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and Mali and Central African Republic and Chad. We should think of all of these places as constituting a new substantive political order, a malignant political order, but nonetheless a political order in and of itself, with its own political structures, its own laws, its own institutions, its own movements, its own forms of state. And just to give you a sense of how we might characterize this political order, I want to share my screen with you again and show you the next slide. Hopefully everyone can see it, which is here kind of a stylized characterization of two different forms of liberal international order. The contrast is forced somewhat in order to illustrate and exemplify the points that I'm drawing on, but the detail for some of these cases and descriptions is discussed in the book and provided in the book. And it's to suggest that we have a genuinely distinct political order that has emerged in the aftermath of the Cold War. And you can see on the left-hand side the kinds of international institutions and political practices that characterize what I call the liberal international order of that period. And on the right-hand side, the cosmopolitan political order and the shift that this has involved. Most strikingly, for instance, halfway down the table, you can see the shift from ideals of national liberation that the new states that have emerged in the post-Cold War era have tended to be characterized instead by ideals of humanitarian protection and have arisen in circumstances in which they are much more controlled and regulated, and in many cases even have emerged as de facto protectorates, emerged on the territory of pre-existing independent states and have had to be carved up and under significant international tutelage and patronage in order to be able to survive. And so you have this shift, and I think what characterizes and what's at the core of this international shift is, and the development of this cosmopolitan political order, is the effort to suppress that institution, which is a remarkable ideal, that is the achievement of political modernity, and that's to say the sovereign state. The idea of a supreme secular authority that recognizes equals and peers, but that has no superior. And that this tremendous achievement of political modernity is precisely what has had to be suppressed and restricted and limited in order for this cosmopolitan political order to emerge. And I think, I mean, we only, being in this country in Britain, I think we only need to think of Brexit over the last few years, the bitterness and divisiveness of debates over Brexit, to be reminded of what a scandalous and radical proposition the idea of sovereignty still embodies. The idea of the collective self-government and political self-sufficiency, just to say, note, political self-sufficiency, not economic self-sufficiency. And so what I propose is that what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria is, and Libya, is the dystopian vision of this cosmopolitan political order. And it's an important conclusion to draw out, I think, because at the core of this cosmopolitan political vision have been the claims of human rights, the idea that the rights of individuals have to be put above those of states, even to the extent of using military force in order to defend those rights. And human rights have been instrumental in suppressing the claims of sovereignty and suppressing the claims of the sovereign state. And from the perspective of cosmopolitan dystopia, I think it behooves us to realize the fact that this allows us to make a judgment on the development of human rights over the last 30 years and to see that their consequences have been dystopian. And the significance of this is that the claims originally to human rights as they emerged in the 1970s and across the 1980s was their modesty, their limited character. Human rights developed in the aftermath of the failed hopes of 1968 and the failed hopes of third world revolutions. And the idea was that seeing the dystopian outcomes of so many radical attempts at political transformation, that human rights would be more modest and limited, that they wouldn't seek to wield state power to radically transform society. Instead, they would seek ethical and legal redress, incremental reforms. They would go through the courts rather than through political parties. They would use NGOs rather than political and social movements. They would try to influence the state rather than trying to seize state power. It was explicitly supposed to be a limited movement. And as the work of Samuel Moyn has shown, the idea of human rights was that it was the last utopia, the utopia that came after the end of all the other utopias. And the idea embodied in human rights was that we would avoid dystopian outcomes precisely because human rights were so limited and modest. And as I want to suggest, as we can see in light of what's happened in Syria and Iraq and Libya, that the outcomes of human rights have also been dystopian, and quite literally dystopian, with the slave markets in Libya, where African refugees and migrants are sold by militias, the slave markets of the Yazidi women and girls in Iraq under the rule of Islamic State, permanent war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, resulting from the disintegration of centralized political authority, resulting from the disintegration of the sovereign state by the elevation of humanitarian, cosmopolitan political ideals above those of state sovereignty. So many criticisms have been made of the foreign policy elites for having pitched us into the perpetual wars that Western states are in now. And it's gratifying to see that there is growing critique of perpetual war with developments such as the Quincy Institute in the US, and the ferocious polemics conducted by people like Stephen Wertheim or Patrick Porter, Stephen Walt, against the foreign policy elites and the military planners who have led us into so many of these calamities. But what I want to say is that those critiques are nonetheless insufficient, that what's needed to be included within all of this is that we need to have an account not only of military failure and strategic failure and foreign policy hubris, but also political questions of the rights of states and sovereignty. And that if we don't make full account of the role that the suppression of sovereignty has played in the development of cosmopolitan dystopia and permanent war, then we will never be able to put an end to the permanent wars that the West is involved in, and we will never be able to put an end to cosmopolitan dystopia. And the role that state sovereignty plays in this, I think, is important to draw out. So it's not simply that, as I say, that what's the outcomes that we've seen in places like Iraq and Libya are failures of post-war planning. It stems directly from the absence of the idea of state sovereignty as an organizing principle of political order. Because if you don't recognize state sovereignty, then there is no legal or political barrier to the projection of power. And as a result, if there's no legal and political barrier to the projection of your power, then it means effectively that any problem in the world is potentially a problem of and for Western power. So women's rights in Afghanistan become immediately a question for and of Western power. Ethnic cleansing and atrocities in Myanmar immediately become a question of Western policy, a question for Western policy. Democracy in Venezuela immediately becomes a question for and of Western power. And then it becomes a question of how far Western power can reach. It becomes a question of how far it's possible to maintain a military presence in multiple countries. It becomes a question of expediency rather than a question of political principle, whether or not Western states have the right to intervene in all of these various countries. If there is no legal and political limit to the exercise of Western power, then the conditions for perpetual war will be constantly recreated. However sophisticated our military planning might be, and however sophisticated our strategic thinking might be, and however much we renew a foreign policy elite, it's absolutely integral to have a core idea of that there are limits to the exercise of power, and those limits are set by the borders between states, by the idea of sovereignty and political self-sufficiency. So now moving towards the end of my opening remarks, I think that these problems stemming from the absence of an ideal of state sovereignty are very evident in contemporary debates in the West and in the US, and with the Trump presidency in particular. So one of the few redeeming features of the Trump presidency has been that President Trump has been less war-prone than his immediate predecessors. But nonetheless, at the same time, this is the matter of skepticism over how far America benefits from the wars that it's been involved with. It's not a recognition on limits to political and legal power of the US state. And this was evident in Trump's assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, that is to say in a third country, not in Iran itself, based on spurious grounds of claiming self-defense. So the point to draw out from this is that sovereignty does not only provide a legal and political shield for developing countries, which is to say that it is a core constituent of anti-imperialism, but that it also enshrines the principle of representative government and accountable government in industrialized nations in the developing world, in the developed world, and in the West itself. That sovereignty is part of the way in which we establish clear lines of political authority and we're able to attribute political responsibility. And this, I think, is particularly clear in retrospect over the last 30 years, because the invocation of globalized human rights has allowed Western governments to curb and suppress the claims of their own voters and the claims of their own citizens. They've effectively managed to delegitimize the claims of their own citizens by claiming that they're responsible for all of humanity, that they need to defend the interests of all of humanity. Western states, through the globalization of human rights and through claims of cosmopolitan political ideals, they've effectively claimed responsibility for everyone and ended up being responsible for no one and responsible to no one. And so to conclude, I want to bring this back to COVID and suggest perhaps a few tentative connections to the COVID crisis, because one thing that emerges very strikingly from the pandemic, in Western states at least, is the astonishing lack of public capacity, the remarkable lack of infrastructure, the remarkable lack of preparation for a pandemic that all the experts, all the civil servants who were supposed to be responsible for these things knew was coming and told governments was coming, and yet nonetheless governments weren't prepared. And even most minimal preparations that you could expect for preparation for such a pandemic seem not to have been undertaken. And that too is a degradation of sovereign responsibilities. And so insofar as there might be any connection to cosmopolitan dystopia, I suppose I might say this, that governments, through invoking claims of human rights, governments in the Western world have claimed limitless jurisdiction throughout the world. They've claimed that there is no limit to their legal and political power, their rights to intervene throughout the world, and their rights to defend the interests of everybody. And in the end, they've ended up failing in their responsibilities to their own citizens. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Phil. Quite a lot of questions have come in. Please keep them coming through the session. I'll try and get through as many of them as possible. So the first, I'm going to treat these questions not in the order that they came, but try to group them together. So the first question comes from Chris Henry, who I think is taking issue with your defense of sovereignty. So he says, Hart and Negri locate the origins of sovereignty even before Westphalia within the monastic religious communities later enshrined in monarchs. Why do you turn into a term so loaded with, sorry, the sentence is a bit garbled. Why do you use a term so loaded with dogma, top-down command and control logic and modernist myth-making? Is it not time to go further and draw up a new concept that, at the very least, actually enshrines representation and accountability than any embodiment of sovereignty has done so far?
Well, I suppose I would say that this is precisely what the argument of the book is, and the wager of the book is. What we've seen is regression from political modernity, and the fact that political modernity, one of the central claims of political modernity, the idea of nations being politically self-sufficient, is still a scandal and still seen to be something which is untenable and dangerous. And therefore, it seems to me still a radical proposition after all this time. And the last 30 years have been an attempt to institutionalize super-sovereign forms of political government. We've been living through the dogma and the myth-making of a post-sovereign political order. We've been living through the dogma and myth-making of attempts to substitute for the sovereign state. And the results have been genuinely terrifying and genuinely dystopian. And Western states have been involved in permanent war and with calamitous results in the countries where the sovereign state doesn't exist. If the sovereign state seems like a modernist dogma and a myth, then I can only suggest to take a look at places like Libya and Iraq. Iraq has been perpetually stuck in a perpetual war since the early 1990s. as a result of international intervention and as a result of a refusal to respect the sovereignty of the Iraqi state. It seems to me we're living through the consequences of attempts to substitute for state sovereignty. And as a result of that, if no matter its origins, it seems to me that it's one of the ideals that should be restored to contemporary political life. And we're suffering from the dogma and myth-making of attempts to supersede sovereignty rather than attempts to enact it.
Okay, next question is from Roger McGinty. He asks, how far would you take your criticism of the rights agenda? I accept that rights have been weaponized as part of the intervention agenda. They often mask insidious forms of neocolonialism and strip sovereignty, but many rights are defensible. Where would a line be drawn?
So I think the problem is casting that rights which used to be articulated within the structure of nations have been recast as human rights and disembedded from within their national political and legal context. And if they're disembedded from the political context and within countries where there's the greatest opportunity and possibility for citizens of those countries to connect their rights to political processes of transformation, political processes of accountability within their own countries, then inevitably what happens is that they effectively, as they're disentangled from within the state, they become elevated to the supranational and transnational level and effectively become rights against states and against the citizens of those states. So my concern with human rights is that they've prized apart the subject and the agent of rights, and that the people to whom the rights are supposed to apply are no longer in a position by which they can shape the exercise of those rights and shape the processes through which those rights are formed, because they've been removed effectively from national level processes of decision making and from national level processes of representative government and democracy in democratic countries. So they've empowered supranational agencies, NATO, the United Nations Security Council, regional organizations such as the African Union, the European Union, at the expense of the people to whom the rights are supposed to apply. So the case isn't against rights, of course not. But the idea is that rights need to be kept in close alignment with the national level political structures through which they're defended, through which they can be recast, through which they can be reformulated, through which they can be reshaped. And the elevation of rights to the supranational sphere has been the destructive element. So cast in universal terms, which is in the universal terms of human rights, obviously has the appeal, the superficial appeal of being more universalistic. In practice, though, what's happened is that they've become effectively, like I say, rights of supranational agencies rather than rights of peoples, rights of citizens, rights of individuals.
Okay, the next question is from Phil Hammond, who's clearly read the book because his question contains references to page numbers. So he says, you note the puzzle of why intervention continues after the end of the bold era of humanitarianism, so in the early 1990s. But what then drives this continuing intervention? You say norms don't cause or drive military intervention or war, so what does? You mentioned the narcissistic quality of Western intervention. This is the engagement with David Chandler, for example, but you reject that. You say Western publics have moved beyond war enthusiasm and war fatigue to numb indifference, and bold claims about the power of humanitarianism are no longer made. So what exactly is driving this apparent addiction to intervention?
This, I suppose, is part of the claim of cosmopolitan dystopia, that it is a substantive political order in itself that to some degree has transcended these, the idea of it's a political order that connects together these issues in a new way. And in this political order in which there is no real recognition of the separation of various jurisdictions and various political authorities, it means effectively that there is no even recognition of the beginning or end of a war, and it's impossible to attribute agency. And so in these conditions, I think the war simply carries on, perpetual war keeps on spinning. And this, I suppose, was most evident to me with the, in particular moments, but when there was the cruise missile strike on chemical facilities of the Syrian government during this, a few years back, which was undertaken under Trump's administration and in collaboration with the French government, it was very clear that at this point there was no possibility of disentangling one particular military intervention from another. That military interventions had effectively collapsed into one continuous period of permanent war, and it was impossible anymore to identify when one military intervention or military operation began and when one ended. All these separate military operations, ideas to rescue the Yazidis, intervention in Iraq, intervention in Syria, they'd all collapsed into a single continuous period. And this is the result, I think, of this cosmopolitan political order in which there is no clear differentiation between different sovereign states. And so if you're unable to differentiate if you're unable to identify different political orders, it becomes impossible to identify when something begins, when something ends. It's impossible to substitute once you've destroyed centralized political authority. It's impossible to replace it with something. It's impossible to build legitimate or viable or sustainable governments in these territories, precisely because the principle of centralized political authority has been overturned. So even though the grand kind of claims of that were made previously, the crusading era of humanitarian intervention that we saw in the 1990s in places like Bosnia, in places like Kosovo, in places like Sierra Leone, and indeed in Iraq in 2003, grand claims for sweeping transformation of regions and countries, even those claims aren't made anymore. Intervention persists, as we've seen. France is involved in a forever war in the Sahel. We keep on bombing Syria and Iraq perpetually without pause. And it seems to me that this is simply because there is no recognition of any alternative. There's no recognition, there's still no ideal of partition political authority as embodied in state sovereignty. War is continuous, and there is no critique of the need to withdraw ourselves from these conflicts. The debates that we do have are about expediency. Do we have enough arms and ammunition? Is it sustainable in terms of our military capacity? Will there be blowback? Those are the kinds of political questions that are military questions that are asked, rather than political questions about what the purpose of the conflict is, why we are there, and whether we have any right to be there to begin with. So I think it's the absence of those political questions that means that we're stuck in perpetual war, even though the grand era of humanitarian crusading is over.
Okay. There's a bundle of questions here about Western states, which I think will allow you to say more about the role of the United States in particular. So I'll give you a few together. Andy Lai asks, is there still any mileage today in using the worn out term Western? Wouldn't it be more helpful to be specific about who we're referring to? And possibly tied to that, Cheryl Hudson asks, as the United States played such a leading role in the liberal political order until 1989 and is so deeply associated with liberal modernity, I'm interested to know where you situate it in the new cosmopolitan order. Does it entirely depend on the leadership? For example, Obama versus Trump, or is there a general trajectory in its direction?
I don't see there's any problem with talking about Western, because it's Western states that have spearheaded these processes. It's members of NATO, and in particular the UK, the US and France. As I say, this is part of the reason that I think the picture has to be broader than just criticism of US foreign policy, criticism of US military behavior, criticism of the US strategy, is because the degradation of sovereignty, the attempt to destroy state sovereignty and overcome it, is something which has been seen across the behavior of all these Western states. And as I mentioned during the presentation, France is itself involved in perpetual war, its own perpetual war in the Sahel, in Mali, in Central African Republic, in Chad, in Niger, that's a place where you have a similar cosmopolitan dystopia. Borders are meaningless, the wars are all interconnected, refugee camps, permanent war on the part of the French state, no viable political alternative, no viable end goal, no viable end, no seeming end to the military conflict, to the military operations and to the conflict there. So I think it's entirely just to speak in terms of the West, because it's Western states that remain most clearly responsible for spearheading these changes, for spearheading humanitarian crusading, and for spearheading the political and legal changes at the level of the international order that has facilitated intervention. And even when interventions have taken place by other states, they've frequently either been at the direct behest of Western states, and we can think, for example, of Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen, would never have happened without the political and military support of the US and Britain, but also that when they happen, even without Western patronage and Western support, they build on the precedent set by the West. And this is very evident in the military interventions by Turkey and the military interventions by Russia. So I think putting the West at the core of the analysis is unavoidable. And with respect to the role of the US in it, it's very much, I think, the exceptionalist vision of US sovereignty, the idea that the US doesn't need to recognize that sovereignty is something which belongs to the US alone, rather than something which is necessarily reciprocal by its very nature, that sovereignty requires recognition of equals, and that this is necessary for the US itself. So if there is to be limits to the executive prerogative of the US presidency, then there needs to be a clear legal and political limit to the exercise of US power. And that means the US recognizing the claims of other states and the rights of other states. So the US has been central in this, like I say, though we've seen President Trump has been less war-prone than his immediate predecessors, but shows no indication that he's willing to renounce the idea of limitless claims for US power over the surface of the earth. And that seems to me to be very dangerous, because it's reproducing the conditions which put us in this situation in the first place. So the need to understand sovereignty as something which is necessarily has to be reciprocated, and necessarily is not only for other states, but also in the interests of citizens ourselves. In our own countries, we need sovereignty in order to be able to draw a line around how far the responsibility of our governments goes, and as a way of being able to hold and rein in our representatives, and to make sure that their claims are limited, and that it better allows us to bend our own governments to our own interests, rather than enabling them to claim to represent humanity as a whole, because the consequences of that have been very evident and very dangerous.
I think that would address Hal Conte's question. You raised the question of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson supposedly promoting restoration of sovereignty, but not really doing so, and whether there would be any change in a Biden or Trump presidency. There's also some questions here, one from Stuart Derbyshire, another from Kishore Buddha, about what does this analysis mean for politics within Western states themselves? How is the undermining of sovereignty expressed in the politics of Britain, France, the United States, in terms of how politics is viewed, organised and conducted? Can I just say also, the question came through from Anton Jaeger, but I was not able to pass that question. So if you could resend that, that would be helpful.
The core claim, I mean, the claim of the book is, or the analysis offered in the book is cast at the level of the international order, rather than on the internal political life of Western states. But the claim, which arises from the book is, as I say, that sovereignty is not merely a shield for the weak, for formerly colonized countries, for developing countries, but is also a way of attributing political responsibility, of demarcating political agency, of identifying the exercise of political power. And the great promise of sovereignty is the clear concentration of political power, the visibility of political power, and therefore the potential, at least, to hold political power to account. So insofar as Western states, principally the countries I mentioned, the US, France, and Britain, have been able to inflate their jurisdictional claims and being able to inflate their political power and their legal power at the international level as a result of cosmopolitan claims, as a result of the globalization of human rights, it seems to me that has been to the disadvantage of their own citizens, because it clearly dilutes the claims that citizens can make on their own governments. When the British state claims to be responsible to the people of Kosovo, when it claims to be responsible for the people of Sierra Leone, when it claims to be responsible for women's rights in Afghanistan, when it claims to be responsible or have the right to intervene, say, in Myanmar, when it claims to consider whether or not to emancipate the people of Zimbabwe, because we have a responsibility for the people of Zimbabwe having formerly been the colonial overlords there, those all seem to me to be effectively means of diluting the claims of British citizens on the British state itself. And that seems to me evident over the last 30 years if we think about how far states have been able to disentangle themselves from representative and democratic accountability. And human rights and the globalization of humanitarian claims is implicated in that. They've been more concerned to wage permanent war than they have been to prepare for public health. And that's exposed by the pandemic. So there isn't a detailed analysis in terms of the internal political restructuring of Western states through human rights. There are other people who have done that. And there are obvious connections in terms of the way in which countries in Western Europe in particular have become integrated into supranational jurisdictions through the European Court of Justice and so on, and through the European Union with respect to human rights claims. I don't set out to do that, but the implication of what I'm saying is, as I say, that sovereignty is something which is necessary for the organization of political life throughout the world. So not only necessary to establish the conditions of viable political order in places such as Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and other places, but also to be able to hold our own governments to account in the West, to make clear the claims in representative government and to lay the basis for accountability and even ultimately for democracy itself. No sovereignty, no democracy.
Thank you. So there's a cluster of questions here about the nature of intervention and whether there's anything such as legitimate intervention. So on one hand, Vanessa Pupovac asks, is there a danger in foregrounding permanent war that we allow the corrosive non-military continuing cosmopolitan processes off the hook? For example, cosmopolitan interventions in Bosnia are reducing Bosnia into a borderland. For example, the role of the IOM, which is unaccountable to Bosnia, or the UN, or the electorates of its donor countries. Sabrina White asks, if there's a hope of emerging from a cosmopolitan dystopia, where does that leave UN peace operations? And Adrian Gallagher says, you say in your EJIR article that there are scenarios in which you would favour intervention. So can you explain what scenarios you envisage and who would you be willing to support conducting any such intervention? For example, does it have to be Security Council authorised and so on?
So with respect to that a focus on perpetual war takes away from other forms of intervention and other cosmopolitan political developments, I think that's entirely fair. I frame my presentation around the questions of perpetual war because it's very much in contemporary discussion. And while I welcome the focus on the dystopic elements, the willingness to acknowledge the fact that we have been in permanent war for the last 30 years, at least since, I'd say, the US invasion of Panama in 1989, continuously then through Somalia, Iraq, the Balkans, West Africa, up to Iraq, up to Libya, up to Afghanistan, and then more recently in Mali and Syria. So unbroken, continuous war since the early 1990s. And I think the fact that this is being acknowledged and is now a feature of public debate is tremendously important, but at the same time it's limited, as I say, because this debate about permanent war tends to be cast in terms of how far it's meeting the national interests of Western countries, the US in particular, how far it's militarily viable, what the character of the strategic planning involved is, without attention to the political aspects of those questions. So in my presentation, I focused on permanent war, but in the book, there is more focus on the non-military aspects, the legal, political, and constitutional questions associated with cosmopolitan politics, and in particular with the rise of protectorates and the notion of sovereignty as responsibility, which is to say that if the political theory of sovereignty as responsibility, its effect is to suggest that states are responsible for their people rather than being responsible to their people. So built into the core political theory of cosmopolitan politics, of cosmopolitan dystopia, is cutting away at the structures of accountability, the ideal of representative government. And so the discussion in the book is broader than the one that I've made in the presentation. With respect to Adrian's question about my EJAR article, which was published some years back and which the book builds on, I think it is possible to think retrospectively of interventions that on balance have been, you could say, despite their heavy costs, on balance, you could say that they were beneficial. And I think, for example, the Vietnamese destruction of the Khmer Rouge regime during the Cold War would probably account for that. I think there's a difference, though, between acknowledging the possibility of exceptions to the rule and reorganizing the international order in order to make those exceptions more the norm. And the danger, this has been the failure of cosmopolitan politics with the result of cosmopolitan dystopia, has been the collapse of the exception into the norm. So rather than seeing interventions as perhaps occasional regrettable instances that are necessary and which we need to think about in terms of mitigation, increasingly the claim was made by generations of academics, policymakers, lawyers, scholars, intellectuals, that the international order needed to be restructured to make interventions more likely and easier to do. And the effect of that was to reorganize international order around the extreme, around the idea of humanitarian emergency, around the idea of recurrent humanitarian crises that needed to be the constant exercise of military and political power to be policed and suppressed and managed. And this blurring of the norm and exception is absolutely constitutive of cosmopolitan dystopia. So to that end, I think I can identify examples from the past, but getting into the game of identifying which kind of intervention under what circumstances I might conceivably support intervention in the day today or in the future, I think is not cuts against the claims I want to make in the book. It seems to me the onus isn't on me to identify circumstances under which intervention might be acceptable to me. The onus would be on others to identify, to justify to their own citizens why an intervention might be acceptable, but certainly not that the international order, the international law, and that international bodies should be reorganized to make intervention more the norm. So this kind of game of playing the hypothetical emergency scenario, we can always play it, modulate the circumstances in such a way that anybody would be forced to agree that intervention would on balance be the right thing to do. I think we've organized political life around those extreme scenarios for far too long, and far too much of our debate among international relations academics has been around those kinds of hypothetical scenarios, and the results of having organized our debate in political life around emergency hypotheticals is evident now in places like Libya and Iraq. And just to finish, I suppose, on that particular point, but also to remind ourselves, Iraq and Libya are both undeniably worse off than they were under the dictatorships of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, respectively. And I think it's worth letting that settle in for a moment, that they're worse off now, those countries, than they were under some of the most brutal dictators of modern times. And that is truly an abysmal, calamitous outcome, and a calamitous judgment on the failure of Western intervention. And I think the torment of Iraq continuously since the early 1990s right up to the present day is one of the greatest crimes of our time, and needs to be foregrounded as one of the greatest calamities of our time, which Western governments bear primary responsibility for.
Okay, we're really running out of time. I think we're not going to be able to get through all the questions that have been asked, I'm afraid, but I'm going to put perhaps a final cluster, maybe we can squeeze another one at the end, but a final cluster of 3 questions which are about why humanitarian intervention persists. Again, to return to that question. So Anton Jaeger asks, why is humanitarian intervention still seen as the only solution to international crises? Is it just about a lack of imagination on behalf of elites? Or are there deeper issues of state incapacity at stake here? Could you maybe bring neoliberalism into the picture? Adam Curson asks, do you believe that the strength of interventions on humanitarian grounds is due to an overindulgence in self-flagellation on the part of Western institutions with regards to our colonial past? And finally, Faith Mabera asks, to what extent do your central arguments tie in with decolonial thinking, which points to the matrix of coloniality which has upheld the hegemonic Eurocentric world system? Isn't liberal interventionism just one aspect of the historical, epistemic, and cultural avatars of Eurocentrism?
So I'll try and address those quickly in turn. So the persistence of humanitarian intervention is, I think, much of it, like I say, is to do, I think, with the absence of a genuine critique. So if you take, for example, debates as over intervention in Iraq versus Syria versus Libya, the notion was we could intervene in Libya because it was militarily easy and the Libyan regime under Gaddafi was isolated, whereas intervening in Syria would escalate, directly intervening, notwithstanding the enormous military support for jihadi militias there in the war against the Assad regime. So the direct Western military intervention would aggravate relations with Russia, possibly escalate tensions there, and therefore we shouldn't do it. So those debates were cast in terms of expediency, whether or not a military intervention would likely aggravate geopolitical tensions. We should do it in Libya because it was easy to do. We shouldn't do it in Syria because it was harder to do. There was no question of political rights, of whether or not we had any right or authority to claim to defend the interests of Libyans or Syrians as against their governments. It was the presumption of right that's never called into question. It's only questions of military, diplomatic, strategic expediency that are limits on humanitarian intervention. So I suppose what I'm trying to put across is that the cosmopolitan political order recognizes no limits, no jurisdictional limits, no political limits. The only limits are those of expediency. And in that outlook and in that framework, then humanitarian intervention will persist. If it is militarily possible, easy to do, it will happen. It will go ahead. And therefore, humanitarian intervention persists. As long as there is no opposition, as long as there is no articulation of an idea of sovereign statehood, then military intervention will persist. With respect to the question of how far it's driven by self-flagellation, if in so much as there is self-flagellation, it's to claim superiority rather than, I think, a kind of it's the claim of the way in which Western states frequently establish their moral superiority over others, whereas in the past it would have been made through claims, say, of racial superiority. Now it's made through claims of having, through historical apologetics and moral superiority by being able to recognize the sins of their past. The effect, however, is continuing imperial force, effectively, and perpetual war in the last instance. So many times the claim of that Western states having been responsible for sins in the colonial era justifies intervention. This was very evident in Britain's intervention in Sierra Leone in the late 1990s, where it was justified by the fact that Britain had been formally in charge and therefore deserved to be in charge again, effectively, which seems to me entirely wrong-headed, though it is in fact part of the justification. So I think the self-flagellation shouldn't be treated too seriously, in the sense that it's another way of establishing superiority. It's another way of claiming moral superiority. It's a way of performing and exercising your claim to superiority because you're more self-aware than the benighted, limited, selfish people in Afghanistan or Sierra Leone or wherever they are. They're not as self-aware and reflective as we are this is what entitles us to intervene. So it's weird that criticisms of empire end up being justifications for contemporary forms of neo-imperialism. And that's in effect the way many of these debates have worked out. And then finally, to the question of liberal internationalism and how far it is a reincarnation of recurring patterns of imperialism. Obviously, it is, but at one level. But I don't want to collapse what's novel and distinctive about the last 30 years into one unchanging pattern of imperial domination, and that there are striking differences between the way in which imperial power was practiced in the past and the way in which imperial power is practiced today. And I would even go as far as to say that I think in many ways it seems to me to be a worse condition, because all it produces in its wake is disorder. There is not even an effort to build viable, or a kind of a respectable effort to build viable institutions of governance in the territories that are left as destroyed by the outcome of Western interventions. We have permanent protectorates, frozen conflicts, or permanent war. So I think there is a risk of collapsing all of these narratives into one, and that misses what is uniquely terrible about contemporary practices of Western intervention. But added to that, I would also say I don't think if a more Eurocentric order means a greater respect for sovereignty, for state sovereignty, an international order which is built around ideas of political independence, of political accountability, of representative government, then I would say I would welcome more Eurocentrism. Because it seems to me that so much of what's been achieved in the last, what's been achieved since the end of the Second World War in terms of international equality and in terms of establishing the bases for viable independent nationhood in the developing world was achieved under the terms of state sovereignty, which is ultimately, historically at least, a Eurocentric ideal. So if it means return, if a so-called Westphalian framework, which was born in Europe, if there was more Eurocentric politics of that variety, I would welcome it.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. There were several questions that we didn't have time to get to, but I will pass these on to Phil, and maybe he will reply to you on Twitter. Phil is a prolific, or via email, but the email addresses have not come through, but maybe you can get those from Chris at Manchester University Press. But Phil is a very prolific tweeter. You'll find him at the Philippics on Twitter. So he may well reply to you there.
And my email is available, can be easily found through a Google search and going to the University of Kent website where I work. And if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, or you feel that you would like to, that I didn't answer any of your questions adequately, or you would like to pursue the debate, by all means, feel free to email me and I'll do my best to respond to everyone.
So I'm sorry to those of you that I couldn't get to. We did get through a great many questions in 35 minutes. Thank you very much for attending, and don't forget to buy a copy of the book when you get your 50% off voucher tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.